Welcome to another session of the Race and Identity Dialogue at Lander University. I am Lucas McMillan, Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. This series is sponsored by South Carolina Humanities through a grant made available with funds from the National Endowment for the Humanities. South Carolina Humanities is an organization that seeks to provide programming to enrich the cultural and intellectual lives of South Carolinians. We appreciate the support of South Carolina Humanities, and we encourage you to learn more about them at their website, schhumanities.org. Today's session of the Race and Identity Dialogue is entitled Race, Politics, and Civic Action. Joining me today is Todd Shaw, an accomplished scholar of race and politics, as well as activism in American life. Dr. Shaw earned his BA from Howard University in Washington, D.C., and then went on to earn a master's and a PhD in political science from the University of Michigan. Today, Dr. Shaw is the College of Arts and Sciences Distinguished Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at the University of South Carolina. He has served in leadership positions at the University of South Carolina, both in its program for African American Studies and as a former chair of the Department of Political Science. His scholarship is quite wide-ranging. He has published many things, 3 books, and numerous journal articles and book chapters. His first book was published by Duke University Press. His latest book is published by New York University Press. It is hot off the press, and I have a copy of it here. It is entitled After Obama, African American Politics in a Post-Obama Era. Dr. Shaw is past president of the National Conference for Black Political Scientists, and he has served on the executive councils of both the American Political Science Association and the Southern Political Science Association. He has been honored and received awards for both his teaching and his mentorship. So, without further ado, welcome, Todd Shaw.
Well, welcome. Thank you very much, Dean McMillan. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, I should tell everybody that I was a graduate student in the department when Dr. Shaw was a faculty member, and I got to help do some research on that Duke University Press book. So that's my big excitement, because I have certainly not published with them myself. So we are now going to walk through some questions and benefit from Dr. Shaw's expertise. So the first question is, how would you summarize the role that race has played in American politics?
Well, in some ways, race is foundational to an understanding of American politics. That this republic was first founded due to a compromise and a debate that was had about whether or not we could be both a republic dedicated to the principles of liberty, of the notion that's found in the Declaration of Independence of all men being created equal, but then also be a republic that embraced slavery. And so there were constitutional compromises that were struck, among the most notorious being the 3/5 compromise.
Right.
But there are other provisions within the Constitution. And so that uneasy compromise, that uneasy sets of questions that even Thomas Jefferson himself wrestled with, this notion of, in fact, is there some way in which a divine punishment will be visited upon us because we have not answered that question of all persons being equal, even though Jefferson himself had his own contradictions on this issue, being a slaveholder. And so, from the founding of the Republic to the Civil War, to the period of Reconstruction, to the modern civil rights movement, and now up to Black Lives Matter, race is foundational to an understanding. You can't understand American democracy and the issues key in this republic without understanding the vagaries of race and racism.
Right. Could you give us some examples of how individuals or groups have fought for social change in terms of thinking about racial discrimination?
Oh, yes, there are a plethora of them. But let me give you an example, since we just celebrated International Women's History, and we're into a celebration of the many ways in which women are indispensable contributors to our society. I'll give you the example of Septima Clark, right here in South Carolina. Septima Clark was a school teacher, someone who had a particular vision about how do we in South Carolina navigate these unjust Jim Crow laws, particularly with regards to voting. And so she, along with many others, Esau Jenkins being among them, in the Johns Islands area, founded freedom schools, where they said, effectively what we're going to do is we're going to teach African American, many times working class, low income, and sharecroppers. We're going to teach them the civic skills, the actual skills of reading, of literacy, and use that literacy so that they can navigate the strictures around voting and registration in the state of South Carolina. So just one of many examples of individuals who are to be admired. And probably Septima Clark is not a name we know as well as we ought to, for all that she did, working with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and likewise being the founder of the Freedom Schools.
Right. I think, and this is where South Carolina Humanities has actually done a lot of work in trying to get folks to understand the complexity of South Carolina history, right. To see, people, whether it's Mary McLeod Bethune or whether it is the 20th century civil rights icons that include Marion Wright Edelman of the Children's Defense Fund.
Yes.
There's really been a lot of South Carolinians that have participated in the struggle for civil rights. And I'm happy that you noted there's a plethora of examples. And that includes, of course, the court cases, the Briggs v. Elliott case
yes.
that people should remember from Somerton. Right. And so how that led to the Brown versus Board of Education. So one of the things that I really like about your scholarship, Todd Shaw, is that you are certainly a political scientist, but your work builds upon, connects with, and pushes scholarship in the disciplines of history and in sociology.
Yes.
So given your scholarly work on social movements, what lessons should activists remember in terms of trying to be successful at creating legal or social or economic or political change?
Well, really, I have a great debt, or I am indebted to the lessons that activists have taught me. And I'll take the example from my first book, Now is the Time, Black Grassroots Activism and Black Politics in Detroit. Activists taught me 3 lessons that I then thought very directly, Dean, about the connection to the literature and sociology around social movements and political conflict. Is protest the right tool at the right time and in the right place, or utility, timing, and context? So in some ways, activists have been, when they're effective, they have to kind of to look at the lay of the land, be mindful of when is the time to move and not to move, when a particular repertoire of protest is effective and when it is not. I mean, in some ways, the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955 was mindful of the power that African American working people, and particularly working women, had in that bus system. They knew that they had the ability to shut the bus system down effectively by boycotting. Now, and they learned that lesson from other activists stretching back at least as far as Richmond, Virginia at the turn of the century. And so being mindful that not every tool is suited to the time, that protest itself at times has to be combined with other forms of grassroots activism, such as voting or lobbying. So I think activists have taught me, and I've seen the insights of the literature to say, looking at and being creative about how you approach various social problems and the need for social change is really quite key.
Is there something that's different when a person or a group is seeking legal change versus, economic or social change that you could comment on?
Yes, I think it in some ways means that you have to be mindful of the target of the protest or the target of the activism, the target of the social movements. As I've learned from the work of Gamson, among others, is that, well, often the target of the protest is not the individual on the other side of the protest or picket sign. If you're picketing the legislature in a political sense, or in the legal sense, I should say, or let me speak to your question most directly about the legal versus economic. So let's say that activists are concerned, and I can think of some examples in Detroit where activists were going into the courts knowing that they were going to effectively lose, against court injunctions of protesting against the raising of public housing. They knew they were going to lose, but they said, effectively, we thought our audience was the newspapers, was the greater public, to gain sentiment within the courts, and so to use the court. Activists in the Black Power movement use this as well, and activists in the Civil Rights movement use this as well. We knew we were going to lose on some level. We knew we were going to be jailed, but we were targeting public sentiment. And so in that regard, it may differ, although they have some parallels in the economic sector. So if you're targeting businesses, there may be ways in which those tools around picketing and protest directly matter, because you're getting at a consumer base, versus the legal question where courts have their processes and their outcomes, and so you may be a longer haul in some regards if in fact judges don't find merit to what's the basis of your complaint. So yes, you do have to kind of adjust and be mindful of these things, although activists have used these tools, some of these same tools, depending on how they wanted to draw in the audience to the fight.
Right. And that's important to remember. Who is the audience? What are we trying to accomplish? And as you noted there, activists really have to think about step 1, step 2, step 3. They have to think about the process of achieving their goals. So what would you say are the qualities that you believe leaders need in terms of advocating effectively?
Well, I think there's some principles that stem from the civil rights movement, and like Ella Baker's vision of effective leaders. Ella Baker would say, strong people don't need strong leaders. And sometimes I project this quote to my students and then ask them to unpack it. And what she meant effectively was that you have to kind of be very small d democratic in your approach to leadership. There were times when Martin Luther King, for all of his brilliance and eloquence that cannot be denied, young activists within SNCC would refer to Martin Luther King as the Lord. Now, why would they say that? They were using the sort of the Southern or sort of Black vernacular version of the Lord. Right. Well, it was sort of like, well, Dr. King comes in on down on a cloud to save us, and that's not their vision of leadership. Young activists within and student activists within Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, among others, said, no, this is about grassroots activism from the bottom up, where we decide what should be done democratically, and we select the spokesperson for the issue, not the spokesperson tells us what to do. And Ella Baker was very democratic in how she approached that. Barbara Ransby did a fabulous book on Ella Baker on this question. So first of all, being sort of small d democratic is key. I think another aspect is being creative. I think creativity and imagination, I have found, is really quite key. Activists have to think outside the box all the time because they're confronted with the rules of the game. And the rules of the game may or frequently may not benefit them. And so like, well, this decision's about to be taken. This is about to come down. What do we do? And so sort of thinking creatively about all the ways in which you can approach that problem and gain at least some ground is key. Then I think activists also have to be patient, and sometimes quite patient. A woman by the name of Ruth Williams conveyed this to me in when I did an interview with her for my Detroit book. And because I asked her, I said, well, Ms. Williams, for all the activism you've done with low-income housing and public housing in Detroit, do you think it's mattered? And she said, it matters, well, about a drop in the bucket. And I said, well, Ms. Williams, why would you effectively do all of this for all these years for a drop in the bucket? She says, well, drops add up. And so having to kind of say, we're laying the groundwork for something to come. We know we may not see it, Martin Luther King in the mountaintop speech, but we're patiently adding and moving so that one day the dam will break, the rock will crack, and there'll be some change.
Right. Thank you for that. So regarding your own life, as a person who has held leadership positions at a flagship research university, has held leadership positions in professional associations, and held leadership positions in community organizations, could you tell us some about your own story and what traits you think may have allowed you to be successful?
Well, I'm going to add just a little bit to the bio, Dean McMillan, and I'll add this, that I'm now in the position in the College of Arts and Sciences as the interim associate dean for diversity, equity, inclusion in the social sciences. So that's yet another
congratulations,
another post I've taken on.
That's right.
So
associate dean.
Yes. So we're part of that community of deans.
Right. That's right.
So I think that what I have attempted to do in my life is sort of just ask a simple question of where can I effectively serve? Where can I effectively serve? And effectively serve in this respect, that I think I have attempted to be an individual who first and foremost listens. That you really can accomplish a lot when you first understand where people are coming from. and the positions I have held have required me to do that, to first understand where they're coming from, to understand their concerns. Not that there's always going to be agreement, but if I don't know your point of view, if I don't know your concerns, if I don't even know sort of what's going on in some ways of what may confront you in life or what troubles you in life, then I can't in some ways build forward and play it forward in us constructing an agenda together. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing is that I've attempted to have collective vision, to not say I'm doing this alone, but I'm doing it in conjunction with others. In fact, I have found I've been most effective with really effective other leaders, by meaning that to the degree that I could draw upon the strengths of others and in some ways sometimes even to be led by their vision in crafting a collective vision, I have found that to be quite important. That in short, I don't have all the answers. In fact, I might not have the answers to the biggest problems. So if I don't listen and don't have a sense of once listening, try and construct a collective vision, I'll presume that I have the answers and miss the boat altogether. And then I think on some level, I've tried to be a leader who, no matter what the challenge, to put others at ease. To get this sense that I'm a guy who, to me, it's really important when I walk into an office, into a setting, when I talk with people, that we connect and say hello and good morning, and not be so busy that I can't those niceties really matter. I have found they really matter. That you really have to be one who sees people, and most importantly, appreciates others. I never tire of saying thank you. because it's because I see the reasons why people should be appreciated, and and when you play it in such a way, sometimes you get some thank yous back. So for all those things, those are the traits I try to cultivate in my leadership.
Well, certainly, I think that's an honest reflection. When I was a graduate student and was tasked with helping you as a research assistant over a summer, you treated me like I mattered. There was no hierarchy, and that's an important thing that you spoke about. I think it's good for our listeners to know that a mentoring award was even kind of named after you. So I think the skills of being a leader and the skills of being a good mentor are certainly things that they go together. So yeah, that's a thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
I'm interested on your views. To what extent do persons of color feel the burden of trying to be a model for others? So I want to set this up. You have held fellowships with the Ford Foundation, with the Social Science Research Council. You've had National Science Foundation grants. You've had all these leadership positions. Can you talk about that burden? And then maybe say something about, does that burden or the feelings of that burden, does that evolve or change over time?
Well, I very much appreciate that question, because it's a question I have to ask myself in this current position as Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which is, as we push forward in a vital agenda on these questions of creating a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable college community, who do these service burdens fall to? Who would be on diversity committees and be parts of this diversity programming? Women and people of color and women of color are those who show up to these tables most often. And then you look at these questions of compensation, of promotion, of tenuring, all of those things then are inequitably distributed, along that continuum. So I think we have to have our eyes open about these questions. I think, speaking to my own situation, the advice I would give others is, yes, be mindful of what you can do and the voice that you bring. I know that there's times I will walk into a very sympathetic room or be in a very sympathetic Zoom room, but I know there's something that's not being said. And I said, well, I'm just going to go ahead, because I've attained a certain level of privilege in the institution. I'm going to go ahead and put this on the table. And I may be wrong. This may not be an inequitable situation. There may not be this issue going on, but I'm going to say it. Now, I say it because others can't or may not be able to say it.
Right.
Are there and I say that particularly for folk who are more junior, who are not tenured, who are not part of the faculty and part of the staff, and thus, there's a different hierarchy there. Right. Does that service burden fall heavily upon me in some ways? Yes, it does. And sometimes I have to grapple with my own career aspirations versus how I want to serve the institution. And so it's not an easy question to get around. But we won't get around it, or we won't make it more equitable if we don't raise it. And so to me, even as I'm pushing forward an initiative in the College of Arts and Sciences at UFSC, I've said to directors and chairs, even as I'm asking you to do this, I want you to keep your eyes open as to who steps up to the mantle. And it shouldn't be just the underrepresented minorities who are charged with this question of diversity. Diversity is all of our responsibility.
Right. Well, thank you for that. Many of our participants in this series, we are thankful, are students at Lander and certainly students elsewhere. What is your advice for students today in terms of professional development?
Well, I think we spoke a moment ago about a mentor.
Mhm.
And I have found that it is hard to go it alone in life and to do well in life. Um, you know, everyone needs someone. You need someone for letters of, just in a pragmatic sense. You and I would have by now taught quite a few students who are aspiring law students. So you need to be able to call upon a professor for a letter of recommendation, and it not be the first time that they really kind of see you as a student if you're sitting toward the back. So you need that mentor connection for a lot of reasons. And I've mentored a lot of students, some of whom were not even who didn't take classes from me, but just sort of said, Dr. Shaw, I want to strike up a conversation, and out of that grew something else. So I think mentors are important. I say that plural because even with the wealth of advice one person might provide you, they haven't had all the experiences there are to have in the world, and they may not be even in the field that you're most interested in attaining. And so you might sort of say, well, this mentor is a professor who feels who sees me as a very good student, but they're not doing exactly what I'm interested in, or they're not exactly in the discipline I'm interested in. And so maybe I can ask them as to who else I can connect with, and realize also that mentors. This is a harsh way to say it, but mentors aren't buddies. There's a friendliness to the connection. Right. But sometimes we have to give hard advice, and we all need to hear hard advice sometimes. I mean, even in my career now, someone needs to say, Todd, can you really accomplish it all? Why don't you put this to the side? My mom is my mentor. Why don't you put this to the side? Now, the other thing that mentors do is the second thing, which is connect us to professional networks. That's the other thing, is that we got to realize we're not going it alone. We're connecting to a professional community. You and I can speak about the sort of folk in our network who, when we're thinking about, doing research, when we're thinking about questions of initiatives and academic initiatives, whatever the realm we're thinking about, we can think about that network of individuals. And being connected to a network is vital in a lot of ways, not the least of which it provides us information, and so mentoring, networks being key. And then one last thing I would say is, and something I know you would appreciate as a dean, is the sense that students have to go a little bit outside their box in some key ways and explore some other experiences, whether it be internships or study abroad or volunteering in civic organizations or organizations, as part of extracurricular. Those things are really quite important. And they give you, particularly in the realm of volunteerism, it really kind of can provide you some insights that you might not otherwise have had, and maybe even some career prospects of things and some employment possibilities that you might not have had if you just sort of stuck to your academic schedule, your curriculum, and pursued it, and then line things up for the next stage a couple of months ahead. So all of those things I think are helpful for professional development.
Well, I appreciate that, and I think we are both academics. We love to talk about academic life, but all students should remember that a university has all sorts of things to offer. And the internships, the leadership opportunities in student organizations, the volunteerism that can happen on campus or in the community, these are really part of the whole picture.
Right.
And that each one of those things, as you mentioned, can add to the professional network, the know-how, the possible mentors that a person has.
Mm-hmm.
I think that wide view is really to be appreciated, and I'm glad you advocated for it.
I agree.
Well, thank you very much for being part of this part of our conversation, Dr. Todd Shaw with the University of South Carolina. We look forward to continuing our dialogue in a live format with you when we join back again for this part of Lander University's Race and Identity Dialogue. Okay, we are now live. So let me first say that for those of you that may not be as used to our sessions, we welcome your questions. You can put comments in our chat, but you can also use at the bottom right of your screen the Ask a Question feature. And I think that is something that we would like to use as much as possible. It's a little bit easier to navigate. I want to begin with, Dr. Shaw, do you have any reflections in watching that conversation that I enjoyed again? But do you have any reflections that you want to share at the beginning?
Well, I am quite happy for this invitation. And so, Dean McMillan, thank you so much for providing this opportunity. That there are times if you listen to yourself, you might say some things that actually make sense. So no, but in all seriousness, I welcome this opportunity and just welcome the level of engagement we'll have this evening.
Well, I want to begin with something that occurred to me as I was watching it. And I thank those that worked behind the scenes to make the video even better. And to add the images of Septima Clark and Mary McLeod Bethune and others. So our youngest son just wrote an essay.
Mm-hmm.
He's in the third grade.
Right.
It had some grammatical issues, spelling issues. That's okay. But the essay was on Marian Anderson singing at the Lincoln Memorial.
Yes.
And this is just another time in which I wondered, and you and I are not historians, but is there something we should think about carefully as Americans, as South Carolinians? Should we think about the telling of the story sometimes not in chronological order, in a way that better shapes how young children particularly see themselves in these big historical figures? And so I guess I'm thinking about the fact that you do learn about history all through K through 12, but so much of it has a chronological orientation to it. I guess I wondered if sometimes you're missing out on the 20th century, particularly the latter half of the 20th century and beyond, of big figures in science or the arts or in academic life. I introduced my students last fall to Ralph Bunche as a diplomat they had never heard of. And that's, to be acknowledged. But, is there a benefit to helping young people in this visual culture that we have, make sure that they see in themselves people that have accomplished so much? You want to talk about that?
Yes. Well, it's funny you raised that, or a coincidence you raised that, because I'm actually engaged in a sort of homeschool course for an adoptive grandson of mine. I've sort of designed a course for him I called African American Civics. And marching all the way from ancient Egypt to present day, just to think through these periods in history. But what I find is the stories that he finds most compelling are stories he can connect to his own. And where we're literally using a text called Black Heroes, and he's sort of, pulling sort of bits and pieces from that. And I'm going somewhat chronological, we're going in order. But what I think is really important is that young people be able to connect to history. History is, and I'll say this as a political scientist, because I appreciate history, that history is a story, it's a narrative. And in fact, if there's one thing that compels us as human beings and have a sense of community and connection and belonging, it's stories. And so how do we tell compelling stories that connect young people to those figures? For a young person to read, for instance, the graphic novel adaptation of the biography of John Lewis. A graphic novel or a comic book could be a way for the young person to say, well, hey, I love comic books, I love graphic novels, I love pictures and the animation, but here's a good story too. Oh, and it's a true story? Yes. So I think if we can use our own creativity as parents, as teachers, grandparents, community members, we can have them connect to those stories that matter and enrich their lives in doing so.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot there, and I think you are touching on the fact for those that have been involved in this series this spring, as well as our series last fall, everyone would know we have really pushed the story of Benjamin Mays, a Greenwood County native who accomplished so much and broke out of many of the parameters that were given him in his life.
That's right.
But we have also told other stories in poetry and literature and in civic engagement. And this, of course, series is hoping that everybody thinks about their own story and their own contribution. Your comments really pushed the idea, and I'll just repeat for everybody. You said, you ask yourself, where can I effectively serve?
Mm-hmm.
And then you also said that one needs to remember to be mindful of the voice that you can bring.
Mm-hmm.
Could we talk about the voice that you might bring or the way in which you might serve and how that might differ between a more formal workplace environment versus a more informal community environment, volunteer environment, or even in one's own family? Can we talk about the differences of the environment shaping what you bring to the table?
Oh yeah, it's the venue matters, the place or the context matters in this regard, and so and to be honest, because we as persons, as human beings, are complex. There are different sides to us. Who I am as the fourth of four boys in my family is a little different than who I am as the professor in the classroom. So and I won't reference what my brothers call me. So, but to recognize, I think what we also have to do is that we have to recognize. Life is so much at times a journey around understanding our own worth, of understanding our place in this world, and that's why in some ways I feel so privileged, and I know you sharing this. We feel a great privilege and honor to be a teacher, to be a professor, because you're helping young people sort out things, and in some ways have an impact on a future I may never see, but by virtue of my students, by virtue of who I work with in the community as younger people, by virtue of younger people in my family, the mentoring, the big brother, the sort of the father figure, the teacher I play, in some ways help them sort out. And of course, I'm still sorting out too. That's a part of life. But yeah, so I think it's really quite important to recognize our own worth, and recognizing our worth, we can appreciate our own voice and then appreciate the contributions of others.
So let's talk about, we mentioned some of your bio in the recorded session, a long and impressive one. Recently, there was a 60 Minutes piece about Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. And it also profiled some other high-ranking officers, general officers of the U.S. military, all of whom happen to be non-white persons. And it was getting at this idea of what is that burden that one feels? How does one present oneself? How is one seen by others? Secretary Austin said, when I was in plain clothes or, the more informal military dress, if I was coming toward a group of people with others, I was the general, but they never looked at me thinking I was the general because of the case of the U.S. military. And I guess I'm thinking about, do you have any comments about the fact you have been the first person in some of the leadership positions that you have held, and what does that feel like? Does it feel isolating? Does it feel like there's an extra burden to bear? We talked a little bit about this, but just comment on your own experience being in these leadership roles.
Well, I'll share this story as we talk about stories that shortly after I was appointed and was very delighted to be elected by my colleagues and appointed by the dean as the chair of the Department of Political Science, I walked up to a member of the staff who is also someone who is someone I could bounce things off and talk about. And I said, don't take this as a strange question, but do you suspect I'm the first African-American to have held this position? And she smiled and said, I don't think you have to ask that question, do you? Well, but when I thought about it, it gave a sense of, well, what unique contribution can I bring to this work of being the department chair? Department chairs have to advocate for members of the faculty. They have to serve their colleagues, to serve the staff, to serve the students. Individuals, I learned in that role, you play a key role in the well-being of the department. And I had a great and wonderful opportunity with my colleagues to recruit 7 new members of the faculty, during my tenure as chair. So that was a great opportunity, and it became somewhat of a more diverse faculty in that regard. But at the same time, you're right, Dean, to ask that question about, well, but I'm wondering, what role model am I serving to other students, to women, to first generation, to African-American students? And so I think I made some inroads, but lo and behold, after I had completed that position, I was asked to serve in this role as Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. That first, as chair of the department, then gave me unique insight to serve as an associate dean in this capacity. And so in some ways, one first builds upon another, and it equips you to go on and do other things where you say, now that I have this knowledge, I know what department chairs think. And then I know uniquely as an only African-American to serve in this role, how I can make a unique contribution at other levels. And so it's a responsibility, it's an obligation. On some days, it does become a burden, but for the most part, for me, it's a glad calling, because I had the opportunity to make a key difference or some difference while I was there.
All right, so we're going to look at some of the questions that you all have provided, and one is moments of political opportunity. Mm-hmm. So how much does the time and place where an activist works, how does that influence the chances of success for the cause or for the movement?
Well, I think timing is key. I think in some ways that the civil rights movement didn't just happen, or what we refer to is really the mid 20th century African-American led civil rights movement didn't happen all of a sudden. It was a sequence of historic and other events that laid the groundwork. Whether it's the fact it happened after World War II, when many of these African-American veterans who said we fought for democracy around the world, why not here in Mississippi or South Carolina? We're adding their contributions to these voices and saying, okay, what of it? It also didn't happen from the perspective of the sense that all of a sudden Rosa Parks would decide to get up and not give her seat up when asked to move. Well, Rosa Parks was connected to the Women's Political Council in Birmingham, Alabama. She was the secretary to the chapters and state conference of the NAACP. She was connected to E.D. Nixon, who was connected to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. And that in part was timing. It was, if those developments hadn't occurred, it wouldn't have set up the ability for Rosa Parks to effectively be the spark. And actually, it's also important to note that Rosa Parks wasn't the first person to sit down. But she was the first individual that the movement made use of her example. And so timing is key. Place and place and the form of protest is key, but timing is key. And so knowing the activists being aware of the political moment is really quite important.
So another question is, Dr. Shaw, you mentioned the burden of diversity within a university should not fall to underrepresented persons. However, as a white person, I would like to know, I would love to help, but hesitate to volunteer for those committees because I don't want it to be another case of a room full of white people making decisions on diversity. What do you think should be the way forward?
Well, I very much appreciate that question, because this is the process of allyship, of how do you serve as an effective ally. You might Google and see a piece that I had the privilege of writing entitled "Being More Than an Ally." And I wrote that piece on the invitation from Dr. Stephanie Mitchum, who's a scholar of religion in religious studies at the University of South Carolina. And what I was trying to say in that piece is a piece I had said in a speech on campus, and Dr. Mitchum says, well, why don't you develop that into an essay? And so what I did was simply take some of my own work in political ideology, public opinion, political psychology, particularly the concept of linked fate, which I talk a little bit about in this Obama book, where linked fate is the idea that, well, my well-being, my perception of my well-being is connected to my perception of a larger group. Well, is it possible to have a linked fate with a group to which you do not belong?
Right.
That is in some ways the definition of being an ally, is that I feel a sense of connection to the well-being of this group, and I feel this group's well-being influences my own, even if I have a certain level at which I'm not experiencing what that group is experiencing. And so to be an ally means to listen, to engage, but to develop your sense of linked fate, to say, and also say, well, with what I can do, the positions I do hold, with the influence I do hold, here's how I'm going to use it toward the benefit of this outcome. But if you simply have conversations, you listen, you engage, I think in many respects, these committees, these efforts and these developments are always looking for allies, because quite frankly, no social movement has as great of influence, or no movement for change has greater of influence if it doesn't have allies.
Well, and I think to your point, I think you just have to have continuing conversations.
Absolutely.
And that's with others, and that is with yourself. And in being, I think, open enough to say, did I say that right? Was I heard? Was I misheard? And so I think we all are going to have to do that. I think the year of COVID-19 has been difficult because face-to-face conversations have been quite limited.
Right.
And sometimes talking through a screen or through email is just not going to work. So conversations just have to go on. So I want to bring up the facilitators of our series, and that is Dr. Shawnette Parker and Reverend Alexis Carter Thomas. And they're going to join us. And I wanted to first pose a question. I see we've got Reverend Carter Thomas, and maybe Dr. Parker will join us in a second. So Reverend Carter Thomas and Dr. Shaw, I wondered if, as we think about race, politics, and civic action, could you comment on the role of the Black church? And I want to just try to put some context to this. So you heard Dr. Shaw mention a big overview of the American civil rights movement of the middle of the 20th century, where clearly the Black church was a key part of this, and many of the civil rights leaders were pastors. There is a whole generation of persons, unfortunately, many of them are dying, who are of a training in seminary and had a religious role, but also this social leader role. C.T. Vivian is an example who passed away recently. And we can think about, you do have people like the Reverend Dr. William Barber of Moral Mondays in North Carolina, who's been active in the past year as well. You've still got a group of leaders who are very much connected to the church, but increasingly, younger persons are not as comfortable with the church. And so I just wondered, from where you all are, from your experience and your academic study, what's the role of the Black church in activism and civic engagement and in pushing for social change? Why don't we begin with Reverend Alexis Carter Thomas?
All right. Hello. Glad to join the conversation. I very much enjoyed this. The role of the Black church in activism. The Black church is activism. It's for many Black people, it's not a compartmentalized social movement. Civic engagement is part of spirituality. It is the way that they connect with God and each other. It's a sense of responsibility and a life of faithfulness. So I begin with that it's not just this thing over here, part of it, but that the way that, whether it has to do with voting, whether it has to do with campaigning for candidates, to dealing with environmental racism in neighborhoods, it's part of the Black church. It's part of the deep sense of calling to participate in social movements. And so I think that that's something that I feel passionate about, in the sense of I've attended many different kinds of churches and worship spaces, but why I am still in the Black church is it feels like a deep sense of call, and honestly, a deep sense of gratitude for what my ancestors did and those who fought. And so part of the reason I find myself in a Black church is this commitment to not just spirituality, but to social activism and the way that comes together.
Thank you. Dr. Shaw?
Well, I think very much the Reverend's point is that the sense that the Black church, that there is this very thin line between secular and sacred, as I think Lincoln and Mama Y'all said many years ago in their work, among others. And so there's always been this sense, the Black church being formed in the context of the enslavement, and from hush harbors where individuals had to run literally into the wilderness to find some sense of liberation and connection to the Almighty. And certainly, brilliant examples such as Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass we're all sort of steep in some ways in the Black church, and then we certainly come into the 20th century. But I in some ways, I think of the Black church, and my understanding of it as a political scientist or a bit of a political sociologist is a conception similar to the broader Black communities, that Black community itself, which is really Black. We really have what I would call, and my mentor sort of informed me to call, a sense of Black communities, plural, and thus we have Black churches, plural, meaning that there's such an enormous diversity. We're often too quickly sort of say the church. The church is a lot of things. It's a lot of people. It's it's the connectional church. It's both the Christian Protestant church in various mainline denominations and many non-connected churches. It's the Muslim movement of America. It's all of these many things that are rooted in sort of the Black connection to the sacred. One thing I will say, however, is I'm curious as to how the Black church is navigating the current moment, given that we're hearing the ways in which Americans more broadly are disconnecting or not, or are checking the box of none, right? Of none of the above, in terms of may have sense of spirituality, but not a connection to organized religion. So I'm wondering the challenges, and I am connected to congregation, but I'm wondering what challenges the church will confront, particularly in the moments to come, past the pandemic, and in this moment, to connect to things like Black Lives Matter and these other social movements. That's a question that concerns me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that for all of our listeners, a faith community is one arena that can inspire civic engagement and community engagement.
Right.
And different faith communities do this in different ways. And they do it in strong ways or not as strong ways, in more formal ways and less formal ways. But yeah, that is just one arena of community engagement and civic engagement, but one central to Black Americans, at least in a historical sense.
I agree.
I'm interested in going to the idea of how do we understand leadership and how leaders define themselves. And I wanted any of you on our panel to talk about that. When Dr. Shaw was writing with his editors in his latest book, they were talking about the parameters that Barack Obama placed around himself, as well as the parameters placed upon him. And leaders have to define themselves. And Obama is an example of a person who came from a complicated ancestral story that then he wrestled with. In the book Dreams of My Father, he talks a whole lot about this. But then he defined himself. And he was not always accepted in the way he was defining himself, I think is one thing to think about. So, to what extent do leaders, whether we're talking about Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin or Todd Shaw as first African-American to serve as department chair, or a person who in our audience today may become the first African-American to serve as a Chamber of Commerce board member or something, what do you all say to students or to young persons? We're all still young, about how do you shape yourself and your identity and your openness to others as you serve in a leadership role?
Can I try to attempt to answer that as much as possible? And I don't know if I'm going to directly answer it, but it's one thing that I've been thinking about because we're talking about the burden of being a leader. And I keep hearing, being the first in your position. And I keep coming back to, though, as much as someone who's the first person of color in a specific role try to define themselves and put forth like, this is who I am, society is going to continue to define it for them. And one of the challenges I feel like, and an added burden, is this, I call it almost the Messiah complex. Not that the person themselves have it, but I'm thinking about, like, I love the movie Judas and the Black Messiah. And I'm actually, this summer participating in an event where back in my hometown where there's this celebration of the Black Messiahs. But I kind of pushed back on that even title of my cousin, because I said, I'm challenged even when we utilize the word Messiah, because you're looked at, it means savior, king. And I think that's some of the criticism that President Obama received, is that he was viewed not to have done enough for the Black community specifically, because people looked at him and said, you're here to save us. You're the first. We finally won. And I think that's one of the biggest challenge. I know for me, having been the first in many different situations in my life, it's saying, I want to bring the change. I'm happy to take that on. But that's also a lot of pressure and that main burden of feeling like if you don't do enough because you're the first, it's problematic, or it's hard to move beyond being that I'm a person of color in this role, and not just that I'm a great person in this role. I'm just a great leader regardless, and that all of my issues shouldn't have to be shaped around, people of color and those things, even though that's near and dear to my heart. But why can't I just do my job and not seek to save people? So that's one of the challenges. So I don't know if that deters a bit, Dr. McMillan, from what you were asking, but for me, when I think about that, that's one of the things I really try to push back on, and not put so much into this person is here to save the race, so to speak.
I'd like to bridge that, Dr. Parker, kind of with the last thing of the Black church, and in areas where I study of, I think, thank you, Dr. Shaw, for naming, like, there isn't one Black church. And often when I use it, I'm speaking of the Black church that was birthed in slavery, but a church of liberation for Black people, and that values and regards Black worship and Black people. But when I think about leadership in that context, part of my research is on liberating the Black church from the plantation and how Black churches have taken on aspects of plantocracy, of the antebellum South that we saw. And my research is about how through ethnography of talking with Black, specifically women pastors, but Black leaders in the church, how many of them deal with, they basically become slave masters on a new plantation. They become this sense of messiahs. They start reinforcing the same roles that were put on people before them. They become overseers, slave drivers, and senses of, it's not always with beatings and punishment. It becomes in the form of withholding pay, of preaching opportunities, of notoriety, of will we support you? Will we cancel you? And so this sense of Black messiahship, how it shows up in Black churches, and often what I've witnessed in Black spaces is we're still working to overcome a form of hegemony that was put on us. And it takes a lot of risk and courage to learn a new way of leadership, to say that hierarchy doesn't need to be oppressive, or collaboration. What I was struck by in my research, the churches that were thriving and the Black leaders were thriving, learned to collaborate and invite people to the table who didn't look like them, whose background wasn't the same, whose education level wasn't the same, because they valued what these people had to offer. And in the churches where I saw more oppression and oppressive systems, it became another fraternity sorority clique. They mirrored the hegemony that had been oppressing Black people. They just learned to thrive and take on the same ways. And they were just people of color doing the same thing. And people at the bottom were working, and there was this disconnect there. As you talked about, Dr. Shaw, I love that, of recognizing people, of saying hello. It had even become let me get some distance. Part of being a Black messiah is I need a little distance. Let me get my guards around me. I don't have the time to say hello, or, I'll have somebody get back to you. But it became this very sense of what I noticed is the way that people described leadership was similar to narratives I read on the plantation. And that's how I started bridging. I was bridging the work is people are talking about their churches and some of their experiences with Black leaders as if they're on a plantation. Yeah.
Powerful.
Okay. So do you want to comment about, Dr. Shaw, you mentioned that activists have to think about utility, they have to think about time, they have to think about context. Do you want to comment about that in this conversation about the Black church and leadership?
Well, I think in some regards, there is this recognition that the African American church is still, as we said before, a central component. And some would say but a central component of African-American community making, the sense of one is a community by virtue of the spaces you gather in, the connections you have, the networks that you have, et cetera. And so I would fully agree that the health of the African-American church speaks to the health of the African-American community. But I also agree very much to the points just raised about the degree to which the church doesn't teach a certain democratic politics. And I mean small d democratic politics, meaning the leadership of women, the inclusiveness of a broader community of, as Reverend Barber and others would talk about, the inclusion. And he would talk about it in the framework of what would Jesus do, in the sense of serving the poor, of serving the marginalized, of thinking of difficult questions for the church, such as the liberation and rights of LGBTQ communities. But all of these things being healthy to teaching sort of that small d democratic politics and really the way the Black church teaches citizenship. So I say that to say that maybe the question of this moment, of the timing of the Black church, is to figure out, particularly in this post-COVID moment, or we're not yet there, but as we move into a post-COVID moment, what does it mean for the church to be resilient in this moment? What are the new tools it should use in this next period to really be connected again to the very brilliant point about liberation? What does it mean for it to use its space and its context, and now even the cyber context as a new place for connection? Those aren't the ways in which I meant sort of timing, utility, and context, but I think those are relevant, broader questions that the church can ask, and not just church leaders, of course. It is, again, going back to the ethic of grassroots activism, the civil rights movement. It's the people. Sometimes it was the people leading the church. Dr. King would sometimes critique his own, often would critique Black ministers, and got into debates with other Black ministers about, there's your people leading you. They're your people. What are you doing? Contradicting and feeling comfortable in what you're doing. So for those ministers who didn't have a liberation framework, pushing against that. So anyway, those are some of the ways that I kind of think maybe a little what I do connect to this broader question.
So I think one of the things that many of our sessions have touched on is identity. And one of the things that those of us who happen to teach college students know is that college students are constantly making choices about how to form their own identity. And they wrestle with that. And I would tell you that people wrestle with that long after college, and that's okay. And as many friends of mine who happen to be gay would say, we don't always want to be defined by being a gay person, or we don't always want to be defined by our race or whatever. So people have to choose how they want to have an identity that they present. And then in some ways that may shape their civic engagement. So I'm interested, I want to turn to the idea of civic engagement and civic action. Talk about over time how that might broaden and that might deepen. And so I'll just ask this for the panel. In what ways can we think about civic engagement? And you can rely on your own story of civic engagement or your own research on civic engagement in terms of a journey of civic action.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Parker, do you want to feel that one?
Sorry, I think I'm unmuted. Yes, okay. I was thinking, and so I was expecting it to go to Dr. Shaw first, because I was actually going to add, because I was reading in the questions here to add in, because someone had come in and asked about recapping civic actions that you can take to promote racial equity. Okay. And so I was going to add to that. So I think I'm going to ping pong it back to you, Dr. Shaw.
Oh, okay. All right.
Add that piece in there as I gather my thoughts.
I'm trying to keep the democratic moment here.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Everyone adding voices here. So I guess so let me just take an example of where I try to have my scholarship and my teaching intersect with my deep regard for grassroots activism. I taught a course last semester that was a social science research course for students in the Ronald McNair program. That is a multi-week program that is trying to encourage first generation and students from underrepresented or more minoritized populations to pursue graduate work. And we read a book by Dr. Sekou Franklin on African-American youth activism. And what those young people got the sense of, because Dr. Franklin in that book, entitled After the Rebellion, talks about the ways, the multi-pronged effort and the multi-year or multi-decade effort in ways in which African-American young people, the students and youth, had been involved in civic engagement and often protest movements. But what they were struck by is we never we didn't have a clue that any of this was going on prior to just a few mentions in the civil rights movement. That this goes at least many decades before, but even when we think about what happened here in South Carolina in 1946, in the gathering of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in the Township Auditorium here in Columbia, South Carolina, where 3,000 young adults were asking questions about police brutality, about voting, about fair wages, questions we are still grappling with today. And so in some ways, even though Dean McMillan, we can ask this question about, what are the new forms? I think there's an important way in which we should think about, are we aware of the history thus far? And what can we learn from those evidences, those ancestral examples? And I had to concede to the students. I said, well, I'll be honest. Before I read Dr. Franklin's book, I didn't know all of this. And so it enriched my understanding too. And so we had a great discussion because some of those young people who had been engaged in Black Lives Matter protests and then came to my class on Zoom. And so it was a very nice exchange between the activism that they were pursuing in their lives and the connections we could make to research, to scholarship, to teaching and education. And so I think in some ways when we can connect across these forums, not presume that the classroom's over here and the civic engagement's over there, but when we can connect forums together, we can really kind of we can really have a really vibrant dialogue about all the ways in which civic engagement matters, might change, and is still quite necessary.
Yeah, so Dr. McMillan, and refresh me on parts of your question because I was listening.
So I guess I'm thinking about to what extent you might talk with our audience about the journey of civic engagement, the journey of civic action, and how that might broaden or that might deepen over time. And some of that has to do with ideational decisions that you make, and some of that has to do with causes that you might take up.
Yeah, so what does the journey look like? I think it's, for me, a lot of times it's very personal, I think, in terms of, I look first, well, what would I want to know? I think right now, a lot of my civic engagement and action is centered around myself as a parent and thinking about what is it that other parents need to know, or what is it that I wish I had known or someone had told me. And then I kind of stem from that and I, work to research and it's nice. And I tell people, sure, you should look at the research, you should look at the history and understanding that. But I think I move from the perspective that most people aren't taking the time to do that. And so I try to be that voice, to be that person, to bring that, even though at the same time, I am very much about people finding out information for themselves and that you shouldn't always just listen to what somebody tells you. But I get it. And I think for myself as a parent, I get why people don't always do that. And so that's where I am and trying to provide information, food for thought, these resources, bringing them, packaging it as much as possible so that people can go out and be the movement and be a part of that. I think it connects to what I do as a community psychologist and feeling like there's this trickle down effect and being able to, do this capacity building within communities that would then leave them with the skills and knowledge to do some of the things that I can. But I think that's something that we have to consider even with like grassroots movements is the capacity of the people, and to know. And sometimes, you have people who want to get out there and go and do these things, but then there's so much missing in the preparation. And I don't know, I think maybe that's some of the critique of our current I always call it the face of the movement, because for me, I have a hard time separating times. I have a hard time saying that we're in a different movement, that Black Lives Matter is a different movement than the Civil Rights Movement or Black Power movement. To me, it's all the same. Only because, like what you mentioned, Dr. Shaw, these topics aren't new.
No,
So I just feel like it's this evolution of it. I think it's this building. I think it's a different, face or a different generation, but it's the same stuff. Just like, if you look at and consider soul music, the music is the same. It's just sampled over a little bit differently and put in a different context, but it's the same. So I feel like it's the same stuff. And so for me, it's like helping them. But then the difference to me is not having the skill sets a little bit to be able to carry out some of these things. And that's an important piece that needs to be had.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. McMillan, I know we're on time and you have some closing words and readings to do.
I want to first say, though, that in community engagement and in civic engagement, you don't just build connections for yourselves. You can build connections and understanding for others. As a parent, this can happen for your children. So the brief story I'll tell here is we were in a neighborhood cleanup kind of thing, and my son met an older African-American woman that he would tell you had a lot in common with his great-grandmother. Mm-hmm. So my grandmother. And it was the way that she talked about, we have to take care of things. We have to be responsible. This is mine. This is someone else's, but I'm willing to put forth the effort to do this or that. And the way in which she spoke about those things and her not happiness with some persons who were not taking care of things reminded him in that moment of his great-grandmother. And, that's a much older white woman. And I just thought that was a great moment. So I think in community and civic engagement, you can get some good things to learn about yourself and to build connections, and those are good things. So
can I say one thing, Dr. McMillan? I know time-wise. Yeah. Building on what Dr. Parker and what was shared about social activism, and when I think about the lens through my own cultivation in the Black church, and social activism goes back to this role of Jesus and this role of incarnation, of God becoming flesh, and that if God chooses to show up in the places that we don't want to go and eat and dine and be with people and provide practical needs and healing and spiritual social needs to people who are in desperate need of it, oftentimes those in the beginning of Black church saw it as their responsibility, to follow Jesus into those places. And so when I think about the journey, my own journey, I agree with Dr. Parker, it's this personal thing. But when I look in my community, it's this commitment to a God that shows up, that literally becomes flesh, that is God with us. But it is living that out too, embodying that, showing up in the places, going and cleaning up, and not just sending money somewhere, not just watching a video and saying like, oh, okay, well, where do we send money? Or I'll just send food. That's good. I'm not, downplaying that. We need people to send food, money. But for often people, for social activism in the Black church, it was, you have to show up physically in those spaces. It's not enough to send money. It's not enough to just say like, okay, yeah, we believe in that, support the cause. But it was a physical being in a space and joining to people. We'll talk more next week in session 8 and civic engagement in your story about how it's actually being with people, because you meet people, you connect and build those relationships that you mentioned about your son, Dr. McMillan. So that's.
Oh, yes, we're always thinking about the next session. We're always thinking about the next session in the series. So we're gonna turn just a bit to the book, which again I recommend to everybody. After Obama, the latest book from Todd Shaw, and in it, he and other scholars are talking about Barack Obama wrestling with having the fact that he is the first non-white person to occupy the White House, and he pushed therefore a race-neutral agenda, really was a de-racialized presidential candidate. And, the book talks about he had obstacles to encounter governmentally, he had obstacles. In terms of the social order of the United States, he had obstacles. And I think we should be mindful that President Obama knew that some did not view him as a competitor, but viewed him as illegitimate in the fact of his candidacy for the presidency. So I guess I want to reflect on this idea with pushback of racial conservatism, it's called, with electoral losses in Congress, that Obama's presidency was much more of a moderate disruption to, rather than a fundamental transformation of, the present racial order. And I wondered, Dr. Shaw, if you could just talk about that, and then perhaps, as a political scientist, help us think about, Joe Biden, who is a very different political animal, happens to be much more steeped in Washington and a white man. But talk about Obama's wrestling with that environment, and then what happened for him, and then in what ways Biden has a different environment to operate in.
Well, I think. Oops, I'm sorry. I think in some respects that Obama was very sanguine, and it still is to this day, about the challenges that confronted his presidency. Although even toward the end of his second term, and right before he was to conclude his presidency, he conceded. I never quite understood until now the level of opposition and intransigence, political intransigence, the depth of the political and racial divide. I mean, I was aware, and Obama is, a supremely intelligent guy. But he says, the idea that that individuals would oppose my healthcare bill partly because I am an African American president, or some of the opposition is rooted in race. And actually, there is literature in political psychology that demonstrates that there are these implicit anti-Black sentiments, and to the degree that one has them strongly correlates with opposition to Obama policy, including the Affordable Care Act. So in some ways, he learned in the process. He was trying to navigate in being what he saw to be a progressive, democratic president who could move forward in the moment, but yet still be electable and re-electable. And I think really in his second term, I mean, I and other commentators, or I and other sort of analysts, including Andra Gillespie, who's written a book on race in the Obama administration, sort of observed that there were measures, particularly with criminal justice reform and the outspokenness more on race that occurred in the second term than in the first. So yes, it is true that Obama confronted what I call the sort of the American racial order. I really don't see Biden's administration as a deviation as much as it is trying to overcome the learning curve of the Obama administration. That Joe Biden's friendship and strong connection to Obama and loyalty to Obama means that he learned from Barack Obama. I mean, Joe Biden credits, and he's right to credit his election to the strong level of African-American support he gained. And he gained that support partly because African-American voters, among others, said, well, he was a faithful vice president to Obama. And so I think Biden in some way is saying, well, I'm aware of the opposition. I'm aware how divided the parties are. I'm aware how there may not be a reliable set of coalitions that I can create, and so there's things I'll have to go alone with my own party. And I'm aware of the need for racial justice, which I do believe that Biden is quite embraces. He embraces that view, but he brings sort of his seniority in Washington to all of these things. So in some ways, he's an outgrowth of Obama, although Biden clearly is taking a different tact and using his stature and using, in some ways, his form of the bully pulpit, particularly in this COVID and post-COVID moment, to push forward what he sees as a progressive agenda. So that's how I think Biden is learning from Obama.
Tonight about race and politics, but I hope that our listeners have not missed all the just terrific advice and lessons about leadership. And so Todd Shaw would tell us to think about being democratic, little d, meaning bottom up, to think about being creative, to think about being patient, to always consider how we might listen to others, to have a collective vision with those that operate in our same spaces, and to do what we can to put others at ease. So we hope that this race and identity dialogue, which began last fall in a semester of programming just for Lander students, but has continued now with the support of South Carolina Humanities and is a public setting. We hope that this series continues to have the ability to create those conversations, to create that dialogue. We very much thank Shawnette Parker and Alexis Carter-Thomas, facilitators of this series, who joined our panel tonight. Yes. And of course, we very much appreciate Todd Shaw, who's not just a scholar and a teacher, but certainly a mentor that I'm sure we have all seen why that skill set is so important. So, Dr. Shaw, thank you so very much for your participation in this series. I hope that those in the audience will remember to take our survey, which we have at the bottom of our screen. We always want your feedback to these sessions. And I hope you will again go to the Lander website, lander.edu/RI dialogue. And if you haven't already, register for our next session, session 8. This concludes session 7. I'm Lucas McMillan. Thank you again, Todd Shaw of the University of South Carolina.
Thank you so very much. And Dean McMillan, I'll tell your home department how you're doing good in the world.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody.